America's longest war comes to a chaotic end. What's next for Afghanistan? Where will all of the refugees go? Is the U.S. still at risk from al-Qaeda? And what the heck is ISIS-K? Here's what you need to know. Good morning, this is Cheddar's Need2Know podcast for Thursday, August 26th. I'm Jill Wagner, here with journalist Mosheh Oinounou, who's joining us for this special edition all about Afghanistan. Hey, Mosh.
Good morning, Jill.
Good morning. So before we get started, some very quick housekeeping. This is going to be our last podcast until after Labor Day. So we're going to be dark tomorrow and next week. So to all of our FOPs, friends of the pod, don't forget about us. We will miss you, but we will be back. Okay, and with that, Mosh, let's get down to business. I have been plugging your Afghanistan coverage for days now on our podcast because it's so good, and I'm thrilled to have you on. Quickly, you've interviewed war veterans. You've interviewed people pretty high up in the government, right?
That's right. I've been trying to get a good gauge for what is going on the ground there, and then how various folks at various levels are reacting. So that included former CIA Director Michael Morell, who incidentally was the person with George W. Bush on 9/11
Wow.
and was with Barack Obama on the day we got bin Laden. So gave really good perspective there. And then some veterans who, one of whom got a Purple Heart out of Afghanistan, was talking about the reaction of veterans watching these images and coming to terms with what they did over there, what it means, what impact they had, given the chaotic withdrawal that they've been watching on television.
All right, I have so many questions. Let's just get started. The first question that came to my mind, and I think probably many Americans, when President Biden said we are pulling all of our troops out, full stop. Does this make us any less safe here in America, in terms of al-Qaeda? Because thinking back, it's been 20 years, but the reason that we went into Afghanistan in the first place is because al-Qaeda attacked us on 9/11. The Taliban was harboring al-Qaeda. So it begs the question, what is the risk that Afghanistan is once again going to become this safe haven for terrorists, specifically for terrorists who are looking to do us harm here in the United States?
So in the conversation I had with Michael Morell, who was at the CIA for 33 years, he was like, the estimate is it's about a year until al-Qaeda can reestablish itself in Afghanistan. But keep in mind a couple things. One, the U.S. went into Afghanistan 20 years ago in the fall of 2001 after asking the Taliban, hey, you have al-Qaeda hanging out in Afghanistan. Give up bin Laden. Taliban's like, no, they're cool. And so the U.S. began its invasion. And over the course of a couple months in 2001, we were able to basically clear out al-Qaeda. Now, most of them ran to Pakistan. We were able to significantly do damage to them. But then in early 2002, so again, 19 years ago, once we cleared out al-Qaeda, the U.S. game plan effectively changed in Afghanistan. We're like, let's remake the country to ensure al-Qaeda and the Taliban can never take over again. So that began effectively stage 2 of the war, which is the war that we lost, right? War 1, we beat out al-Qaeda. War 2 is, let's make sure Taliban can't come back. That war continued over the course of the last 20 years, cost us $1 trillion, cost us thousands of American lives, tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of Afghan lives. And that is the war that we lost. And so the situation as we know it is the Taliban inevitably was going to take over again. They fought us to a draw. At some point, the U.S. we didn't want to stay there. This is going back to the Obama years, 10 years ago. So it was always a matter of when we're going to get out and when the Taliban's going to take over. So are we less safe? Well, sure, the Taliban was going to take over. They have taken over. And so the question is, can we manage any threat from Afghanistan from afar, the same way the U.S. manages a threat in Yemen, a threat in Syria, to a certain extent Iraq, though the U.S. still has some troops there that we're looking to pull out. And so can we use drones and planes and satellites to manage the threat? And given what's transpired over the course of the past couple of weeks and months, are we going to have a relationship with the Taliban? And we've had to negotiate with them. So does that mean that we have some collateral that will be able to incentivize them to not give safe harbor to groups like Al-Qaeda? Now, one thing to keep in mind, Taliban says Al-Qaeda had nothing to do with 9/11. So as
Right.
far as the Taliban's concerned, Al-Qaeda is not a terror group because from their point of view, they never committed terror attacks against the U.S. The U.S. did it to itself.
Right, I was listening to this interview with Richard Engel, with the Taliban spokesperson, and he's like, yeah, there's still no evidence that it was bin Laden who did 9/11. So you, just to a follow-up, so you said Mike Morell said it's going to take Al-Qaeda a year to reorganize. So okay, that doesn't make me feel great, to be totally honest.
No.
Okay, so is Al-Qaeda, all these years later, is the U.S. still target number one? I mean, is this a group that is still out there without bin Laden, looking to do harm to the United States?
Well, understand this, that we have done significant damage to the Al-Qaeda infrastructure. The Al-Qaeda group that existed in the late 90s, that organized the attacks on the U.S. embassies in 98, on the USS Cole ship in 2000, and 9/11, they record extensive planning, extensive research, extensive coordination. The infrastructure and the leadership structure is almost completely out, minus the number two that we've never been able to find, Ayman al-Zawahiri. So reestablish itself, yes, that's concerning. At the same time, keep in mind a couple of things. Our technology's advanced, our homeland security has gotten much better. We are still target number one. Here on the homeland, we're much safer. But does that mean that Al-Qaeda might seek out an American target abroad somewhere? Potentially, yes.
Right.
Keep in mind, too, that, you're never going to completely eliminate Al-Qaeda. They're going to find a way to exist, because it's not just a group, it's a philosophy. And so people, who share that philosophy, who are inspired by it on YouTube or social media or Telegram or WhatsApp, they have methods of organizing. But organizing 19 terrorists to take out 4 planes, it's going to take them a very long time to rebuild that type of infrastructure. So when we talk about reestablishing Al-Qaeda, it's kind of having a place to reorganize in Afghanistan. Sure, can they concoct an attack, an organized attack like they did in 9/11? That's going to take them much longer.
Okay, and then there's also now you've got Al-Qaeda. So you've got the Taliban, which wants to be the government, which basically is going to be the group that's going to run the government. You've got Al-Qaeda, which is terrorists who attacked the U.S. on 9/11, who the Taliban was just giving safe harbor to. And then Biden used this group, ISIS-K. So I've heard of ISIS, because ISIS was the group that kind of came out of everything in Iraq and Syria. What is ISIS-K? What is this? And what is their relationship to the Taliban?
In 2021 parlance, it's the variant of ISIS. So
it's the Delta variant equivalent, I guess.
Correct. Slightly more contagious and concerning. So the deal is this: the Taliban are almost entirely Afghans who want to control their government, right? They have little foreign interest. They want to manage Afghanistan the size of Texas. Al-Qaeda shares a similar Islamic fundamentalist philosophy with the Taliban, but is mostly made up of foreign fighters. So these are fighters from Chechnya, from the Middle East, from various Arab countries that have made their way over to Afghanistan. Al-Qaeda has international ambitions. They want a Sharia law internationally, and target number one is America. They also, by the way, have an offshoot called the Haqqani Network. So it's effectively, but I won't get into details there, but effectively there's offshoots. I mean, there's affiliates, there's spin-offs, almost like you think about a business. Then you have ISIS. ISIS is a separate group that came out of, as you stated, Iraq and Syria, the Islamic State of Iraq and Syria, ISIS. And they are competitors with Al-Qaeda. They believe that Al-Qaeda and the Taliban are not fundamentalist enough, are not serious enough.
Okay.
They have a much more extreme, so they're like, these guys, they're soft. We're much harder. So ISIS-K, ISIS Khorasan, K stands for Khorasan, which is a name for the region. They developed in Afghanistan, and they are competitors with Al-Qaeda, and they're like, these guys are weak. We're going to showcase how much stronger we are. Now, the Taliban and Al-Qaeda can't stand ISIS-K, and in a sweet bit of irony, the U.S. has actually helped the Taliban fight ISIS-K in Afghanistan as an Islamic State competitor. So it's a very complicated web, but just view it this way. There's multiple competitors who all have a stake in the game here and want to say, we're the strongest group. We're going to show the Americans what's going on.
Maybe they'll get so busy, fighting each other that they leave us alone.
Well,
Is that? I don't
yes.
know.
I
okay.
saw one analyst who's referred to Afghanistan as the Las Vegas for terrorists right now. Everyone is showing up.
Okay, so the other question that I have had, and I'm sure other people have as well, as we look at the images that are coming out right now of refugees, of Americans, of African Americans, and also refugees who are getting onto these planes, and they're going, I don't know where. So that's the question. It seems like total chaos. Who are they? Where are those planes going? And what is ultimately going to happen to the tens of thousands of people who are leaving Afghanistan right now? Where do they end up?
So think about it as separate groups. There's Americans who worked at the embassy, who worked for non-governmental organizations and nonprofits, some of whom were contractors. The U.S. has spent $1 trillion there. We've built infrastructure there. So they might have been working on a construction project there, et cetera. So there's that initial group of Americans who are there. Then you have Americans who have some sort of familial relationship with Afghans or might have married in to Afghans and have been living there. Because remember, this country's been pretty unstable, but Kabul to a certain extent has been, I don't know, by Afghan terms, stable for the past decade. So those people need to get out. Then you have a bunch of foreigners because it was a NATO operation. So Belgians, French, Germans, Koreans, Indians have built a whole bunch of infrastructure there and invested. In fact, they built some cricket stadiums and et cetera. So they need to get out. Then you have Afghans and separate them into multiple groups. You have Afghans on what are called SIVs, special immigrant visas. These are Afghans who might have helped the U.S. military, might have helped journalist organizations, might have worked with American companies. Then you have Afghans, and you have their families. So now you're talking about 20,000 special immigrant visas to the U.S., plus maybe 50 or 60,000 family members. And then you have groups that are concerned about their future in a Taliban-led Afghanistan. You might be LGBT and felt open to come out. You might be a women's rights activist. You might have been, just various activists for things that the Taliban does not believe in. You might not have an SIV, but you're like, my fate is not good. I don't feel good about my fate in the new Afghanistan. Now, where are they all going? There's about 20 to 25 countries right now that are involved in the effort. Even those who are coming to the U.S., they're making pit stops in our bases in Germany, in Qatar, in Bahrain. Some are going to Uganda. There's people going to Costa Rica. The young Afghan female robotics team, which was concerned about their future in a Taliban-led Afghanistan that doesn't educate women, all ended up in Mexico. So
wait, and that's their final stop? Like that's not a holdover until they come to the U.S.? That's where they're just actually going to live?
I don't know, but the Mexican government has said they will take on a few Afghans. The Canadians said they're taking on 20,000. The British said they're taking on 10,000. So it is an international effort. But one thing to keep in mind, as of Afghan refugees as of last year, almost 90% of them ended up in the two neighboring countries, Pakistan and Iran. So there's a whole bunch of countries in the West, some in Asia. The Koreans just took on 3,500, but the vast majority are making a rush right now to the land border because Kabul airport has been so chaotic, and it's just easier for them to sneak in. To the west, they have Iran. To the east, they have Pakistan.
Really, it is so fascinating. And then what becomes of Afghanistan at that point if all of the journalists and the doctors and the civil servants or the people fighting for women's rights, what becomes of that country if all of those people leave, or many of them leave? They, in theory, they would be the backbone of a democracy. And one of the things you mentioned yesterday when we were prepping for this podcast today, which I thought was fascinating, is that the majority of the country is made up of people who are under the age of 20. So they don't really know life under the Taliban. They really just know the American troop presence and an attempt at some type of democracy. So again, what does Afghanistan look like under, I guess, Taliban 2.0, particularly if so many of these people who would be the backbone of the democracy wind up leaving?
Well, that is why it's been such a struggle for some folks, some Afghans, and whether they're going to leave the country or not, and why people are like, well, they knew the Taliban was taking back the country. Why haven't they gotten out? well, this is their country. This is the country they fought for. This is the country that they spent 20 years trying to rebuild from the 5 years the Taliban was in control of it from 96 to '01, but really from 30 years of war. You have to go back to the 70s to the last time that, so almost 50 years ago, to the last time Afghanistan wasn't in a civil war. And so even the Taliban has said, like, doctors, lawyers, like, you need to stay here. You need to help rebuild the new Afghanistan. And many of them are like, no, not the Afghanistan that you want, but this is the country that I love, that I'm passionate about. And so they've struggled there. You've seen this happen in other countries where you've had a major brain drain. Lebanon is a country that used to be called the Paris of the Middle East. And for years and years of war, the educated classes got out of Lebanon because they did not see opportunity there. And so when you have all these people who've built these institutions, who've been educated, leaving the country, you're kind of like, well, they could affect change there, but then they also know that maybe that they can't, this is not an Afghanistan they want to raise their children in, so they're leaving. And so that is really the unfortunate thing, because when you look at the state of play there, almost 50% of the population, I looked this up last night, is under 15 years old, was born in this millennia, right? And so then you bring it to under 22 and it gets to 60-something%. It's a very young population. None of them remember what Taliban was like. And they're all just like hearing these stories from 25 years ago and like, okay, well, maybe the Taliban is right when they say they've changed. Unlikely. But and so for the most part, a lot of them are like, I'm getting out of this place. And that's the next generation of that country that's been raised in this new Afghanistan. So you're going to have a bunch of people leave and a new generation now be raised under Taliban rule. What does that mean? Well, it's concerning.
Well, you say the Taliban's now saying that they changed. Unlikely. And part of your coverage that I thought was so interesting, I think I've definitely read it on your Instagram account, was that the Taliban are like trying to retrain their soldiers on how to even deal with women, right? I mean, that seems. I don't know. It's just. I guess, are we buying into this Taliban, kinder, gentler Taliban 2.0?
I don't. I know that rhetorically they've given these press conferences where they're like, women have a role in New Afghanistan based on we have to do an assessment, though. We have to ask a bunch of Islamic scholars on how women should be treated, on how women should interact with society. I mean, it really, if anyone's listened or watched The Handmaid's Tale, it is scary how much this feels like Gilead, right? Like, well, the men have to decide what the women have to do. And we're going to be open to journalists, but only if you report positive things. So the Taliban has an incentive here because they knew how difficult it was to rule the country during those 5 years from 96 to '01. They were only recognized by 3 countries in the world, and everyone else had sanctions on them. Pakistan, the UAE, and Saudi Arabia. Saudi is probably out this time, given how things have evolved, but they want to say the right things because guess what? When the Taliban said we're cool with women, guess who was like, maybe we'll have a relationship with you? Russia, China. So the Taliban is incentivized right now, especially given how new they are, to say these things. While journalists are still on the ground there, they're going to say these things. Now, what the world and what Afghanistan looks like in a few months is unclear, but they want to begin soft pedaling to have these relationships. But given what we've seen and what their rule looks like in the rest of Afghanistan, it's not a pretty picture. So that's why, I'm pretty skeptical.
I mean, look, when you think back, we've been now there for 20 years. And I think back, if you're of a certain age if you're an American of a certain age, September 11th is a pivotal moment in your life, right? There's it's one of those very few things where we could say, exactly where you were when those towers were attacked on 9/11. And I mean, for me personally, it changed my whole life trajectory. I decided I really wanted to become a journalist. I went to grad school. I studied religion. I used to try to speak Arabic. I would read Arabic. It changed everything in my life, right? And I know for my husband, one of his closest friends actually died on 9/11 in one of the towers. I mean, everyone has their stories, right? Of every American, of the connection that they have. I'm sure there's a generation of young men and women who decided to fight for this country because of what happened on September 11th. So we're 20 years, we're about coming up on the 20-year anniversary, $1 trillion more than that spent in Afghanistan, about 2,500 U.S. troops killed in that country. What have we gotten for it? I mean, what is the benefit? Is there any good that came out of it? Can you walk us through that a bit?
Yeah, it's interesting. My trajectory changed too. On 9/11, I was in D.C. as a college student and evacuated the Capitol. It was the first day of my internship. Ended up, covering the attacks for the college newspaper, and had that impact on me. And for a bit, also was like, maybe I need to join the military. Like, this is, you feel this sense of, we were attacked, and we need to do something. And so, as far as the impact of the war in Afghanistan, it's kind of what I laid out a little bit earlier, which was the first thing was to get to Afghanistan and get the group that did this, right? Get bin Laden, get Al-Qaeda. So as far as we're concerned, and you would remember this, and any listener would remember this, like after 9/11, we were freaked out that this was going to happen again and again. When is the next attack? Well, 20 years later, thank God, there have been no further significant Al-Qaeda attacks to the U.S. homeland, right? So if you were to say, what have we achieved? Well, if the goal number one was to stop terror attacks on the U.S. homeland, then mission accomplished, right? Now, since then, ISIS is shot up. I mean, there's been other groups and attempts at various small attacks. And by the way, a lot of credit goes to the FBI and CIA and the various arms that, have been reinforced after 9/11. So bottom line is this: no major terror attack on the homeland, mission accomplished. As far as part two of our goal in Afghanistan, building a new Afghanistan. Well, healthcare is improved by a range of measures, right? Nearly half the population now has access to sanitation. That's doubled since the early 2000s. School, secondary education for girls. 8 million more children are in school in Afghanistan more than they were in 2001. The vast majority of children were educated until the age of 10 in Afghanistan and then didn't receive a secondary education. That's now jumped from 12% to 55%. And we can go to a whole range of measures: child mortality, hospitals, NGOs, etc., in terms of that achievement. Now, those are the achievements that are most at risk here, given that you have a new regime in charge. But if security of America is mission one, we achieved that. Great. As far as helping to build a civil society there and giving opportunities to months of people that didn't have it, great. Some of them have left the country and now can use those skills somewhere else. Great. And one would hope that, given what was experienced, though, that maybe the Taliban sees a country that witnessed more rights for women and education for, secondary education, and wants to preserve some of that. That would be the hope. But of course, the country is controlled for the most part by them at this point, minus a small region, and it's their prerogative what they want to do.
So President Biden taking a lot of heat right now, pretty much from everybody, actually. So there are a lot of people who say they agree with his big decision, which was to withdraw from Afghanistan. They just don't think that he did it the right way. But then there is also this cohort of people who are saying, look, we should have and could have just kept a small number of American troops in Afghanistan indefinitely. Kind of like South Korea, and there are certain places where we just have a U.S. troop presence. For the past year or so, no Americans lost their lives in Afghanistan. But it really would have prevented, the argument, I guess, would be that it would have prevented the Taliban from taking over. So when you talk to Mike Morell, when you talk to the war veterans, is that what they would have preferred? What is the thought process on kind of that alternative reality?
Yeah, I mean, that's the complicated thing, is like, well, what else could Biden have done? And obviously, for those of us who were not in the White House Situation Room, knowing what his options were, it's hard for us to kind of, though a lot of people will lob rocks and be like, well, you could have done X, Y, and Z. Now, the issue Biden faced coming into his presidency in January was that the agreement with the Taliban was already signed by the Trump administration. And by the way, the reason why we didn't see any attacks on the U.S. soldiers that were left in Afghanistan is because we effectively made a deal with the Taliban in the last year of Trump's administration, which is an 18-month deal. We should have been out by May of this year. And in exchange, we wouldn't attack the Taliban, and the Taliban wouldn't attack the U.S. for 18 months. And that is why you didn't see any attacks on U.S. soldiers or any U.S. fatalities. So people are like, well, the 2,500 U.S. troops that were remaining there for those final 18 months were keeping us safe. Well, not necessarily. Like, that is a very hard, small group to defend. It was because the Taliban and us basically were looking the other way at each other. And so ultimately, it's something to keep in mind. Now, one argument for the other side is, yes, we had a small presence. We would have to eventually pull them out because 2,500 troops in Afghanistan is indefensible. You know, as Mike Morrell, the CIA director, told me, he's like, we would have had a series of small Benghazis around the country, kidnaps, bombs, etc., if we broke the agreement with the Taliban. So as far as Biden was concerned, he had to abide by it. He pushed it back to August, but he didn't feel he could push it back any further or bring more troops in without risk of pissing off the Taliban. For lack of a better term.
No,
and so
it's interesting.
Yeah, go ahead.
No,
Yeah,
please continue.
Yeah, and so the one argument, the arguments for what Biden could have done differently. A permanent base in Afghanistan was never going to be tolerated by the Taliban. You know, for them, this is wholly Islamic territory, and we're not having the infidel have a base here. Okay,
right.
That's not in the deal. That's not in the cards. South Korea, Japan, Germany, other places the U.S. has had bases for more than half a century post-wars are different stories. Okay, but could Biden have done something differently? Most certainly, right? If the intel assessments were the Taliban's taking back the country, could you and should you have streamlined the visa process to get out Afghans? We're going to leave thousands of Afghans behind. Likely that we promised to get out of the country. Those people face potential, something as bad as death under Taliban rule. That is the U.S. basically going back on its word to people. Should in the spring, when they were getting warnings from Congress, guys, the visa process is broken. My interpreter, who saved my life in 2008, is at risk with his family, and nothing was done. That's a problem. Secondarily, the base that we had just outside of Kabul, it's called Bagram Air Force Base. The U.S. built it, cost $1 billion+. The U.S. military left that in early July. That is a base we could have controlled and could have gotten evacuations. Our understanding is much more seamlessly. At least it provides a second place beyond Kabul commercial, airport to evacuate people. That was a choice the U.S. made to get out, to take out all the soldiers. And so there's a whole school of thought here, and we're going to spend months, if not years, looking back at this, that should Biden have taken out all the troops before the civilians were gone? Probably not, because guess what? 2 weeks ago, we had a troop presence of 0, effectively, minus the Marines who protect the embassy, and had to bring back 7,500 soldiers and Marines to conduct an evacuation. And we had pulled out the last 2,500. So we basically had to bring in triple the initial amount for this last second effective evacuation of Afghanistan.
Okay, so we are almost out of time right now, but I just want to hit one of our favorite stories. I know both you and I kind of just appreciate this. So there is one Jew left in Afghanistan, correct? And he just won't leave. So you cannot make this up. Really quickly, I did a little research, and I actually know a lot of Jewish people who came from Afghanistan. There used to actually be a vibrant Jewish community in that country. We're talking going back hundreds of years. Things got progressively worse starting in about the late 1800s, and by the 1960s, most Jews had left. But then there were literally 2 Jews left who hated each other, right? And then apparently one left. Okay, so what is the situation?
So there's one Jew left. His name is Zebulon Simintov, okay? Now, he is hanging out there on his own. He's been offered trips free of charge to leave the country. He's decided to stay for a whole variety of reasons. There's some complicated family drama that he's trying to avoid. He won't give his wife a divorce back in Israel. But so he's hanging out and living on his own. The more entertaining story was that in the late 90s, effectively, he goes to Israel with his then wife, comes back to Afghanistan a month later, is like, you know what, I want to prefer to live by myself in Afghanistan. Fine. He comes back and sees a man living in the synagogue. And it's the other Jew of Afghanistan at the time, this guy named Itzik Levy. So you have Simintov and Levy. And it turns out they hate each other. And they both spend basically the late 90s and early 2000s until during Taliban rule, basically fighting viciously over the synagogue, making accusations, going to the Taliban authorities, being like, this guy stole this guy stole this. Effectively, long story short, the Taliban puts both of them in prison because they can't deal with this infighting. They don't know how to get to the bottom of it. They're like, both of you are going to jail. As it so happens, they're fighting so viciously in jail, the Taliban guards get sick of them and have them both leave the prison. They're like, the two of them are fighting. They're so annoying. You know what? Both of you are released from jail. Go back. Well, the two of them live at opposite ends of this small synagogue, this like shabby little synagogue in Kabul, and they're both living in the synagogue, continuing to fight. Now, it turns out that Levy passed away, I think, in 2005. So now it's just Simintov. But anyway, in reading these stories, it caused me to rediscover this kind of drama. And you're like, this would be an amazing Mel Brooks meets Larry David type Broadway show.
It is a big, I think Mel Brooks came to mind, and Larry David just like, you could see him being potentially jailed and annoying the guards so much that they're like, just get out of here. We can't listen to this anymore.
It's crazy. Apparently, Simintov, the guy who's still alive, had accused Levy of running a secret brothel where he sold alcohol, which like is like a million sins in the Taliban world. And he's like, I don't run a brothel, nor does alcohol. And I live 20 feet away from you in the synagogue.
Well, we will eventually have to take that story to Broadway, Moshe, one day, because it's too good. And
if
I guess
any lyricists are listening, we would love someone who could compose some lyrics and some songs about this.
Lin-Manuel Miranda, we need you. Okay, Unfortunately, we have to wrap, but Moshe, that was great. Thank you so much, because these were all questions that I know I personally had, and I can only imagine that our Need2Know listeners were also wondering the same thing. And obviously, we could go on a lot longer, but again, we are out of time. Mosheh Oinounou, journalist, thank you so much for coming on. Really appreciate it.
Appreciate it. You can check me out at MOSHEH on Instagram.
Yes, guys, follow Mosheh. You'll be much more well-informed throughout your day. All right, that is what you need to know for August 26th. Have a good day, everybody.